All right, welcome to another deep dive. We know you're all about getting those aha moments, those big breakthroughs in understanding. And you're definitely not here to get bogged down in tons of details, right?
Exactly. We get it, especially with something as big as philosophy.
Right. We're here to help you get right to the core of these really complex ideas fast. So today, we're going to look at a period you might not immediately associate with skepticism, the Middle Ages.
Yeah. You know the usual story. Skepticism after ancient Greece and Rome just sort of vanished. Poof. Then, bam, it's back in the Renaissance.
Right. Like it took a long vacation. But the thing is, and this is what we're digging into today, based on what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, is that, well, that's not the whole picture at all.
Yeah, like you won't find a medieval philosopher proudly wearing a badge that says, I'm a skeptic.
Right. Like they had a little club or something.
But here's the thing. Skeptical ideas were all over the place.
So what we're doing today is like detective work. We're figuring out how medieval philosophers dealt with this idea that maybe, just maybe, knowledge is kind of slippery.
Yeah, like trying to grab smoke.
Exactly. So we're going to look at the kinds of skepticism they bumped into, the thinkers who wrestled with it, and why this whole period is way more important to skepticism than people realize.
Really important stuff.
And to do this, we're going straight to the source. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, you guess it, medieval skepticism. It's like our treasure map.
Awesome.
Okay, first things first, we're going to bust this myth that skepticism just went poof during the Middle Ages.
Right, no one was going around with a Team Skeptic t-shirt.
That's skeptical issues, that's a different story.
Totally. Think about it, like localized skepticism. Can we really know for sure what causes things to happen?
Right, like did that butterfly actually cause a hurricane?
Or did the hurricane just happen anyway? Big questions. And they spent a lot of time picking apart classic skeptic arguments.
And it's funny how this all peaks at the beginning and end of the Middle Ages.
Like bookends. You have
Yeah.
Augustine way back in the 4th and 5th centuries.
Right.
And then, boom, it's back with a vengeance in the late 13th century. Henry of Ghent, John Duns Scotus, these guys were diving deep.
It's like they were passing the skeptical torch.
And here's the thing, these weren't just monks in a library, thinking these thoughts in a vacuum. They actually set the stage for some really big ideas later on.
It's true. The article even says that some early modern rock stars like Descartes, I think, therefore I am, that guy.
Oh yeah, Descartes, he was huge.
He actually got some of his best material from these medieval debates. Like
Mm.
the whole evil demon thing,
Yeah.
that's totally a medieval idea at its core.
Like a greatest hits album, but for skepticism.
Exactly. Okay, so before we get too deep into the Middle Ages, let's do a quick recap of the ancient Greek and Roman skepticism that was floating around back then. Two main flavors, Pyrrhonian and academic.
Right, like choosing your ice cream flavor. Pyrrhonian, they were all about peace of mind, ataraxia. How do you get there? You suspend judgment.
Don't choose a flavor, just enjoy the cone.
Sort of. They use these arguments, called tropes, to show that any claim you make, well, you could just as easily make the opposite claim.
Like a philosophical seesaw.
Exactly. And that leads to this, okay, I don't know. And from that, hopefully, comes peace.
Makes sense. But, how do you actually live your life if you doubt everything?
Right, like if you doubt that food keeps you alive.
You're in trouble.
Big trouble. The article points this out, too. A true Pyrrhonian skeptic would basically be stuck, paralyzed.
Frozen by doubt. So what about the academic skeptics? Did they have a workaround for that?
Yeah, their approach was a little less extreme, I guess. They were still like true knowledge. That's probably not happening.
Right.
But you can still get through life using what seems plausible. You don't know it's true, but you can act like it is.
Like a best guess.
Exactly. And here's a key thing for understanding medieval skepticism. Academic skepticism, that's the one that really stuck around.
Why is that?
Texts, basically. The main Pyrrhonian texts, especially Sextus Empiricus, they were kind of hard to come by in medieval Europe.
Like a limited edition?
Totally. But academic skepticism, they had Cicero, especially his books De Natura Deorum and Academica.
Right.
And get this, Augustine argued against the academics in his book Contra Academicos. So the term academicus, it basically became synonymous with skeptic.
So when a medieval philosopher was throwing shade at academics, they were actually talking about skeptics.
Yeah, pretty interesting. And to make things even more fun, medieval philosophers often mixed up Pyrrhonian and academic skepticism.
Like a philosophical smoothie.
Exactly. So they had this kind of fuzzy view of ancient skepticism, but it was still their starting point.
Okay, so let's talk about Augustine, the OG skeptic fighter of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, he was a big deal. Before he was a saint, he was actually into skepticism himself. But then he wrote this book, Contra Academicos, in the late 4th century. It's like his anti-skeptic manifesto.
So what were his arguments?
Well, he basically said, if you can't really know what truth is, how can you even say something is truth-like?
Makes sense. It's like if you don't know what a real Picasso looks like, how can you spot a fake?
Right. And he also said, true wisdom requires actual knowledge. So, skeptics. Not wise. Sorry, guys.
A bird. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. He pointed out that if you're always doubting, you're basically going against what everyone else believes. Not exactly peaceful.
So skepticism is a recipe for social awkwardness.
Maybe. But his biggest argument was against this idea that you can't know anything for sure. The skeptics had this logic. To truly know something, your idea of it has to be caused by that thing and nothing else. No dreams, no illusions, just pure, direct connection.
So high bar for knowledge.
Sky high. And since the skeptics said our senses are unreliable, well, they thought true knowledge is impossible. Boom.
Okay, Augustine's turn. How does he counter that?
He tries to find claims that are totally, absolutely, 100% undoubtable. Like, there's either one world or not, or if there's more than one, there's a finite number or an infinite number.
It's like a cosmic multiple choice question.
Right. And he asks the skeptic, how could these statements be wrong? They cover all the possibilities.
Good point.
But then the skeptic comes back with the classic, how do you know there even is a world to have a number? You know, that whole external world skepticism thing.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
Augustine's answer is pretty slick, though. He says, okay, things seem a certain way to me. That's my experience, right?
Makes sense.
And then he says, for me to be wrong about something, something has to seem a certain way in the first place. Like if nothing ever appeared to be anything, we wouldn't have anything to be wrong about.
Wow, that's actually, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. So even if we're not sure our senses are giving us the real deal, we can't doubt that we're having these sensory experiences.
I'm following.
Then Augustine brings in math and logic. 2 + 3 = 5, no matter what's happening in the outside world. And logically, nothing can be both true and false at the same time.
Solid examples.
Right. Those are certainties no matter what. Then there's his famous argument from On the Trinity, which is like a sneak peek at Descartes.
Oh, yeah.
He says, even if you doubt everything, you can't doubt that you're doubting.
True.
Because to doubt, you have to be alive, remember why you're doubting, understand what doubting is and all that.
Looks like doubting itself cancels out the doubt.
Exactly. Then Augustine goes even further with his theory of illumination.
Which is?
God's ideas, like a perfect blueprint, are what make true knowledge possible. They're the ultimate standard of truth.
So we know things because God knows things, and his knowing is perfect.
Basically. So Augustine gave a pretty strong answer to skepticism, all within a Christian framework.
All right, let's jump ahead a few centuries. We're going east now to the Islamic world and a philosopher named Al-Ghazali.
Yeah, Al-Ghazali. He wrote this book called Deliverance from Error. And get this, it has these elements that almost sound like Descartes, centuries later.
What, really?
Yeah, he was obsessed with finding knowledge that was so certain, so clear, that there was no room for doubt, no illusions, no tricks.
Like knowledge you can take to the bank.
Exactly. And to get there, he basically went on this doubt marathon, questioning everything, kind of like Descartes' method of doubt.
Okay, so what did he doubt?
Well, first, all our senses. He pointed out how easily they can fool us. Like a shadow that looks still but is actually moving super fast.
Oh, yeah, like those optical illusions.
Exactly. Or how tiny the stars look even though they're massive.
True.
And he didn't stop there. He questioned reason itself. Like, what if those logical truths we take for granted are actually wrong?
Whoa.
Yeah, it's mind-bending. And, of course, he brought up the classic dream argument. How do we know we're not just dreaming all of this?
That's always a fun one to ponder.
Right. So he went through this intense period of doubt, like he was trapped in a web of skepticism.
Yeah.
He even said he couldn't find a way out through logical proofs because any proof would rely on some basic principles, and he was doubting those too.
So he was basically in a philosophical stalemate.
Totally. And this went on for like 2 months. He was a skeptic in his heart, but he didn't broadcast it.
So how did he finally break free from all this doubt? Did he find some super proof that convinced him?
Nope, he said it was God. He described it as this light that God cast into his chest, a kind of divine revelation.
Wow.
Yeah, and he specifically said it wasn't logic or arguments that brought him back to certainty, but God's grace. He even warned against thinking that you need proofs for everything.
So it was more about faith than pure reason.
That's how it sounds. Which is interesting compared to Augustine's theory of illumination. They both have this divine element, but Al-Ghazali's is more personal, like a mystical experience.
Like a bolt from the blue.
Right. And Al-Ghazali didn't just doubt our senses. He also questioned the whole idea of cause and effect in his book Incoherence of the Philosophers. He
Oh,
said just because we see things happen together doesn't mean one causes the other.
that sounds kind of like Hume, centuries later.
Yeah, some scholars see a connection there. So we have these big-time thinkers, both in the Christian and Islamic worlds, tackling skepticism head-on.
Okay, let's move on to the scholastic period in Europe. The article says this is when skepticism really took off, especially after the 13th century. Why is that?
Well, universities were popping up everywhere, and scholasticism, that's the style of learning they used, it was all about debate, logic, writing down arguments.
Like medieval philosophy fight club?
Kinda, but more importantly, they got their hands on tons of Islamic and Jewish texts that had been translated.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, including this book called Optics by Al-Haytham. It totally changed the game.
Al-Haytham, or Al-Hazen as they called him in Europe. Why was his Book of Optics so important?
He said that a lot of what we perceive isn't just a direct snapshot of reality. Our minds are constantly making these tiny, lightning-fast inferences based on what our senses are picking up.
Like our brains are doing all this behind-the-scenes processing.
Exactly. And that means even stuff that seems totally obvious to us might actually be the result of these hidden inferences. So it opens up the possibility of being wrong on a much deeper level.
Whoa.
And then he goes on to list all these optical illusions, showing just how easily our senses can be fooled.
Yeah, like the bits stick in water.
Exactly. So even though Al-Haytham wasn't a skeptic himself, he gave later thinkers all these tools to really dig into how our senses might be leading us astray.
Okay, so we've got universities buzzing with ideas, new texts coming in from the East, and this growing awareness that our senses might not be so reliable.
Mhm.
What did the big scholastic thinkers make of all this?
Well, it's interesting. Thomas Aquinas, he was a huge name, but he wasn't that bothered by skepticism. Yeah, he was a big Aristotle fan. He believed that, for the most part, our minds are pretty good at figuring out reality.
Makes sense.
And he had this theory that when we know something, our minds actually take on the form of the thing we're knowing.
Like a mind meld?
Kinda. So according to Aquinas, it's actually hard to be wrong when you're in that state of direct knowing.
Okay, interesting.
But, scholars still debate exactly what he meant by all that.
Yeah.
Anyway, compared to Aquinas, Sigurd of Brabant was much more focused on skepticism.
So what did he have to say?
Well, he actually entertained the possibility that everything we see might just be an illusion, a dream.
That's a pretty radical thought.
It is. But his answers to these skeptical worries were kind of short and sweet. He said, just because our senses sometimes get things wrong doesn't mean they're always wrong.
Makes sense.
And he also used that classic argument, if we can't trust our senses at all, then we can't know anything. Which, a hardcore skeptic probably wouldn't find too convincing.
Right? They'd probably be like, exactly.
Exactly. But it was a common way to push back against skepticism.
Okay, so Seeker was at least thinking about these issues, even if his answers weren't super detailed. Now, the article says Henry of Ghent and the condemnation of 1277 were a major turning point for medieval skepticism. What happened there?
Well, Henry of Ghent, he was around the same time as Aquinas, and he was really interested in skepticism. Like, the first few questions in his huge book, the Summa Questionum Ordinariorum, were all about skepticism.
Wow, he went all in.
Totally. And what's interesting is that most of his fellow philosophers, even though they knew Augustine's work and were aware of skeptical arguments, they weren't as obsessed with them as Henry was.
He was like the poster boy for medieval skepticism.
Exactly. And he didn't just rehash Augustine. He pulled ideas from all over the place, even indirectly from guys like Heraclitus and Democritus.
He was a real philosophical omnivore.
Totally. He presented arguments for and against the possibility of knowledge, like, if the world's always changing, how can we know anything for sure?
Makes sense.
Or, how do we learn anything new if we don't already know it?
Right, that old paradox.
Yeah. And he also brought up classic anti-skeptic arguments, like, even if you say you can't know anything, you're still assuming some kind of knowledge.
Right, you can't know things.
Exactly. And of course, he loved Augustine's, I doubt, therefore I am.
So he was basically a walking encyclopedia of skeptical arguments.
Pretty much. But then he had his own solution to the whole problem, this idea of created and uncreated exemplars.
Okay, break that down for me.
He said, our senses give us a glimpse of the world, but it's always changing. But our minds can extract a more stable, created exemplar from that.
Like a mental snapshot of the essence of a thing.
Exactly. But that's not enough for true knowledge, for Henry. To get to real certain knowledge, you need to connect that created exemplar to the uncreated exemplar.
Which is?
God's ideas, the ultimate blueprint.
So kind of like Augustine's theory of illumination, but with an extra step.
Right. And this is where it gets tied to the condemnation of 1277.
This is a big deal, right?
Huge. It was basically the church cracking down on certain philosophical ideas, especially those that seem to limit God's power.
Okay.
And Henry was involved in this condemnation. But here's the irony. By emphasizing God's absolute power, they actually opened up a whole new level of skeptical doubt.
How so?
Well, if God can do anything, then couldn't he deceive us on a massive scale? Not just little illusions, but like our whole reality could be a trick.
Whoa, that's terrifying.
Right. So even though Henry was trying to defeat skepticism, he actually helped create a new, even scarier version of it.
That's wild.
It is. And that new kind of doubt about God potentially deceiving us, that became a major theme in 14th century philosophy.
So things are getting even more intense now.
Totally. Philosophers started dissecting the difference between knowing something directly versus knowing it indirectly. And they were really wrestling with the implications of illusions and this idea of a God who might be messing with us.
Like Descartes' evil demon, but a few centuries earlier.
Exactly. So let's talk about some of these 14th century thinkers. First up, John Duns Scotus. He had some issues with Henry of Ghent's approach.
What didn't he like?
Well, he said, even if our mental picture perfectly matches God's idea, that doesn't mean it matches anything real in the world.
Good point.
So Scotus said God designed the world and our minds in a way that allows us to know things reliably. But it's not about directly seeing God's ideas. It's more like God set up the system and it just works.
Like a divine clockmaker.
Kind of. And Scotus was famous for listing 4 types of knowledge that we can be absolutely certain about.
Mirror them.
First, self-evident truths, like the whole is bigger than the part. Can't argue with that.
True.
Second, knowledge of our own internal actions, like I'm thinking right now. Can't doubt that.
Makes sense.
Third, knowledge from experience. Basically, if we see something happen over and over again, we can be pretty sure it'll keep happening.
Well, he wasn't 100% sure about that one. Right.
Right. He later admitted that this kind of knowledge might not be absolutely certain, just highly probable.
Fair enough. What about the 4th type?
That's knowledge from our senses. He thought if our different senses agree and our intellect can sort out any conflicts, then we can be pretty sure we're perceiving something real. He even said we can usually tell if we're dreaming or not.
So he wasn't super worried about a deceiving God.
Not as much as some later thinkers. The condemnation had happened, but he didn't focus on that as much in his arguments.
Okay, so that's Scotus. What about his contemporaries? The article mentions Peter Oriol, William of Ockham, and Adam Woodham.
Yeah, they were doing some fascinating stuff with intuitive cognition and sensory perception. Oriol, in particular, had this theory that actually made the possibility of illusions even more, well, possible.
How so?
He agreed that there's a difference between knowing something directly and knowing it indirectly. But he said intuitive cognition, that direct knowing, is really about how we experience something, as if it's right there in front of us.
Even if it's not.
Even if it's not. So that means you could have a super vivid experience of something that's totally fake.
Like a hallucination.
Exactly. And he gave all these examples of illusions, like dreams, mirror images, the bent stick in water, even those weird after images you get after staring at something bright.
Yeah, those are trippy.
Right. And to deal with this, he made this distinction between real being and apparent being.
So what's real and what just seems real?
Right. But even that distinction is kind of tricky. Some scholars think he was leaning towards the idea that we only ever really know our own representations of the world, not the world itself.
Which would be a problem for skepticism.
For sure. But Oriol wasn't a skeptic. He still thought we could know things about the world, and he held on to the certainty of logic and stuff like that.
Okay, what about Ockham?
He was like, okay, Oriol, you make some good points about illusions, but I think our intuitive cognitions are actually infallible.
Meaning?
If we have a direct experience of something that exists, we know for sure that it exists. And if it doesn't exist, we know for sure that it doesn't, even if God is trying to trick us.
Bold claim.
It is. But then his own student, Adam Woodham, was like, hold on. If God could be deceiving us, how could we ever tell the difference between a real perception and a fake one?
Yeah, that seems like a problem.
Right. But, like most of these thinkers, Woodham still believed that our senses are generally reliable in practice.
Okay, so we've got this back and forth about how reliable our perceptions are. What about William Craythorne? The article says he was really influenced by the condemnation of 1277 and this idea of God's unlimited power.
Yeah, Craythorne was all about using God's omnipotence to create skeptical scenarios.
Like what?
Well, he imagined God preserving the image of something in our minds even after it's gone from the real world.
Like a divine Photoshop.
Kinda.
Yeah.
Or he imagined God just creating sensations in our minds without anything actually causing them.
Whoa.
Yeah. He even used the example of a fiery circle. You know, if you spin a torch fast enough, it looks like a circle of fire.
Right.
He said God could do that, create that sensation in our minds even without a real torch.
That's freaky.
It is. But Craythorne still agreed that there are some things even God can't do. Like, he can't make contradictions true.
Right. Even God can't make 2 + 2 = 5.
Exactly. And he also agreed with the "I doubt, therefore I am" thing.
So what was his take on the whole sensory skepticism thing?
He actually combined Henry of Ghent's and Scotus's ideas. He said, yeah, God could deceive us, but a good God wouldn't do that systematically.
Okay, that's reassuring.
Kinda. Finally, we get to Nicholas of Autrecourt and John Buridan. They were both at the University of Paris, but Autrecourt was a bit of a radical.
What made him so radical?
He said this other philosopher, Bernard of Arezzo, his views basically led to total skepticism.
Like we can't know anything.
Pretty much. He said we can't even be sure of our own senses, our actions, the external world, the past, even our own minds.
Yikes.
Right. And Autrecourt's own view wasn't much better. He said the only things we can be absolutely certain about are the principle of non-contradiction and whatever follows logically from that.
Okay, so very limited certainty.
Very. He even had this skepticism about cause and effect, kind of like Hume later on. And he said the only thing we can know for sure is our own soul.
Wow, so he was basically doubting everything except logic and his own existence.
Pretty much. And unsurprisingly, the church wasn't a fan of his ideas. They condemned him.
Makes sense. What about Buridan?
He was more mainstream, but he still took Autrecourt's skepticism seriously. He actually wrote about it in his Questions on Aristotle's Metaphysics.
So what was his response?
Well, he agreed that illusions, dreams, and a potentially deceiving God are all serious problems. But he said we can still have some certainty about the world, even if it's not absolute certainty.
Okay, I'm listening.
He said the principle of non-contradiction is a bedrock truth, and there are tons of other self-evident principles too. But when it comes to our senses, he said, we can only be conditionally evident, meaning we can be pretty sure, but there's always that tiny chance that God is messing with us.
So always a sliver of doubt.
Right. And he applied that same kind of conditional certainty to things like cause and effect and making inferences from experience.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our deep dive into medieval skepticism. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, the main thing is medieval skepticism wasn't one big movement. It was more like a bunch of individual thinkers grappling with these really deep questions. And they did it in their own unique ways, influenced by their religious beliefs and the philosophical trends of the time.
And they made some important contributions to the whole debate, right?
Absolutely. They really emphasized the certainty of self-knowledge, that whole "I think, therefore I am" thing. And they brought in this unique challenge of a God who could potentially deceive us. That's a very medieval flavor of skepticism.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
For sure. And while scholars are still figuring out exactly how medieval skepticism connects to later skepticism in the Renaissance and beyond, it's clear that these medieval debates laid some important groundwork. The article even mentions Second Scholasticism in the 16th and 17th centuries, where they were still arguing about some of the same stuff.
Wow, so the conversation continued.
It did. So, to wrap things up, here's something for you, our listener, to ponder. This medieval obsession with God's power and the potential for deception, does it have any relevance to what we're thinking about today?
Like, think about simulation theory, the idea that we're all living in a computer program. Or any of those other radical skepticism ideas that make you question everything.
Yeah, those. Even though the context is different, do these medieval thinkers offer any insights into those modern debates? It's something to think about.
Definitely. I mean, at the core, it's all about the same basic questions, right? What can we know? How do we know it? And can we ever be truly certain?
Exactly. And the medieval thinkers, they were wrestling with those questions in a really deep and fascinating way. Their answers might not be ours, but their struggles are still relevant even today.
Absolutely. Well, that's our deep dive into medieval skepticism. Until next time, keep those aha moments coming.
And keep questioning everything.